Hi, good evening and welcome to another edition of Little Atoms with me, Neil Denny, and with Padraig Greedy. Little Atoms is a live talk show about ideas. Each show features a guest from the worlds of science, journalism, politics, academia, human rights or the arts in conversation. Our guests bring ideas that are challenging, sometimes controversial, often polemical, but always interesting. And we're joined tonight by Douglas Murray, who Padraig is now going to introduce.
Good evening. Douglas Murray is a best-selling author and commentator based in the UK. His most recent book is the critically acclaimed Neoconservatism, Why We Need It, which Christopher Hitchens praised as a very cool but devastating analysis. He appears regularly on the television and radio across Europe and America. He is a trustee of the newly founded European Freedom Fund and a member of the advisory board of the European Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Since April 2007, he has been director of the Centre for Social Cohesion in Westminster, London. Sorry about that.
You're a mouthful.
Good evening, Douglas.
Evening.
Managed to struggle through that. So I think maybe, we won't dwell too long on this, but going back to your last book, Neoconservatism, Why We Need It, I think what needs to be clarified for a lot of people is neoconservatism, what is it?
Well, it was always said that neocons were liberals who'd be mugged by reality. There's now a sort of phenomenon of second-generation neocons who've never gone through the sort of trot upbringing that, say, the first generation had. But generally speaking, I mean, I say that we tend to be people who look at the world through a particular perspective. It's not a school of thought as such. It's certainly not an organised grouping. We sort of straddle a sort of liberal and old-school conservative divide. I'd say that we're realists who also believe that although realism is a good way of looking at the world, it's not always the best way of acting in the world. And you can look at the world through realist spectacles, but act in the world as you'd like to make it. I.e., we can do better than just managing.
Mm-hmm. So how would this contrast, or does it contrast with classical British conservatism?
Well, classical British conservatism, I'd have said, has several major differences from neoconservatism. One of them is that typical sort of British conservatives tend, among other things, to be exactly the sort of management types. I mean, you sort of manage the world. The 1990s was a big, a particular situation in the Balkans was a big wake-up call for many of us. You sort of saw a conservative government that really not only had lost its moral compass, fairly obviously, but didn't really recognise that force can be a force for good, as it were. This is a problem with the left as well, broadly speaking. The left often believes in progressive ends, but doesn't believe in the use of force. Conservatives don't believe in the progressive ends, but do often believe in the use of force. Neoconservatives believe in the progressive ends and the progressive possibility of the use of force. So we're, as it were, sort of alienated from everyone.
So what are those progressive ends? I mean, what are the values that you're talking about?
Well, mainly the belief that societies find their end point, their end point, that is the point of fruition in representative liberal democracy, and that this is something you have to fight for, you have to keep fighting for, and just because you've got it yourself doesn't mean you don't encourage other people to get it. I mean, you don't say, well, I'm all right, Jack, we're fine here in Britain, we'll allow our brethren in Iraq or elsewhere to continue to live under sink dictatorships. We think we can do better than that. Now, there's then a follow-on problem about whether or not the use of force is always applicable, and of course it isn't. But there are occasions when I think the liberation of peoples from tyranny should be something we do, and not just wish for.
These seem liberal values, really. I mean, what's the difference? What's the nuance that sets somebody who calls himself a neoconservative apart from your everyday liberal who believes in secular democracy and?
Well, nothing other than, they say, we tend to sort of act on it. I mean, the joke used to go that if a neocon was a liberal who'd been mugged by reality, what was a neoliberal? And the answer was a liberal who'd been mugged by reality but who refuses to press charges. And neocons have never been accused of not pressing charges.
So where is the neoconservative project now? I mean, we can look at Iraq. Iraq was a secular state.
No, it wasn't. Of course it wasn't.
It was an incredibly depraved state, but I mean,
it was not a secular state. Saddam Hussein had set himself up as a religious figurehead. He had religious ambitions, as it were. You can't separate out. This was not a secular state.
But the position that it's in now, where there's basically anarchy, pretty much all sort of civil society has been what, as such thing existed, if it did, has been dismantled.
I'm not sure I'd say anarchy. I mean, I haven't been in Iraq for about a year now, but anarchy is to vastly overstate the situation certainly a year ago, and is to get it entirely wrong now. I'd say that we are in the process of winning, probably not far off winning if there ever is a victory point in Iraq. We're pretty much there. The insurgency has been pretty much quelled. Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia have been annihilated. They've retreated to their last stand, from which they're being got rid of at the moment. And I think this is good and important work. Iraq has taken 5 years, thanks to the forces of international jihad. Has taken 5 years, longer than we would have hoped it would have done, to have got properly on its feet as a working democracy where the people are able to turn up to the polls without such a fear of being blown up and massacred by their alleged co-religionists. It's taken 5 years. That's regrettable, but I mean, I'd point you to the example of somewhere like Malaya. Malaya, it took 10 years for the British to get on top of the insurgency there. These things do take time.
So that's it. It's just that it's not working. It's just that we haven't given it enough time.
No, I mean it is pretty much working at the moment. I mean you have for instance, this extraordinary sight of Jalal Talabani, who under Saddam Hussein's reign and previously was hiding in the mountains with his guerrilla fighters, as they then were. You see this man, a great Kurdish leader, a great Kurdish fighter, now occupying the post of president of Iraq. I think this is a fairly impressive bit of progress. This isn't to say, I repeat, this isn't to say that Iraq is by any means in a perfect situation, but I would argue that it is currently in a much better position than it was going to be at if, for instance, we'd left the country to the successor regime of Uday Hussein or his charming brother. You don't get a choice sometimes between the greatest option in the world and the worst. I think we had a bad option in Iraq in having to liberate the country from the Hussein family. The worst option was to leave them in place.
Mm-hmm. So you say correctly that Al-Qaeda in the region, and Al-Qaeda more broadly, as I understand, is, as we originally understood it, is on its knees, to say the least. But there is an argument put forward by people on the right and the left that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have invigorated rather than diminished militant jihadism.
Well, what you end up there is you end up in a logical kind of whirlpool, mm-hmm. because if when your cities are attacked by people who've been provided by training camps in Afghanistan, for instance, just to take that one, if you decide that when you're attacked you can't attack back, because if you did you would create the problem, you end up in the problematical situation where you'd have to admit that or believe that terrorism is caused by us reacting to terrorism. Now, in my opinion, militant Islamist fundamentalism has a very distinctive force of its own, which could get on perfectly nicely without our interventionist assistance, if you believe that's what it is. Mm-hmm. You can always find a reason. We don't intervene in the Balkans, and jihadis train to attack us because we don't intervene. You do intervene, and jihadis train to attack you because you do intervene. You have forces in the north of Saudi Arabia, which Mr. bin Laden cites as being a reason to attack us on 9/11. You move the troops north from Saudi Arabia into southern Iraq, and he doesn't write a letter of thanks. I mean, do you really want to apologise for East Timor, one of their crucial points of hatred towards us? No, I mean, I think we have to some extent, not at 100%, but to some extent, be fairly dismissive of the jihadis' claims that just because we have reacted to them, just because we've annihilated one of their training camps, just because we've sunk a dictatorship which supported their causes and paid, in the case of Saddam Hussein, for instance, paid the families of suicide bombers in Israel, that if we do those things to get rid of those people, that we must be bringing it on ourselves. Come on.
Yeah. But is there... I came across an argument recently that we have to readjust our sight of what a victory, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but globally against terrorism and terrorism coming from different motivations, as it will do in the future. That there is an element of limitation rather than absolute victory involved.
Sure. Well, the war on terror, an unpopular phrase. Increasingly unpopular phrase, I think, after Mr. Bush leaves office. But the war on terror, I've always said, will never have a ticker tape parade at the end of it. There will never be a point when our troops are all home and where everyone can celebrate a victory. You do, however, have to consider what victory would look like. I've got a fairly clear idea of what victory would look like in the war on terror. To me, the war on terror victory would be a sustained, thriving democratic state in Iraq, which other dictatorships in the region looked to, not with awe, but with concern. That Bashar al-Assad would not feel quite so keen, quite so comfortable sitting on his inherited throne in Syria. That the Ayatollahs in Iran wouldn't feel quite so happy that their people mightn't look across the border and think we also could have representation of a meaningful kind, not dictated by a couple of candidates put up by a bunch of clerical fascists in Tehran. I think these are the sort of things that we would see at the point of victory. But the point of victory will not itself be discernible. The alternative, of course, to it is you have to consider, once you've considered what victory looks like, you would also have to consider what defeat would look like. I'd say that we would know defeat in this. We would notice defeat much more easily than we would notice failing, but it would be clear.
And I mean that's addressing the great question of the Middle East and beyond. Are we engaged in a parallel battle in Europe?
Well, there's a battle certainly going on in Europe. It's a battle which is, of course, very connected to the Middle East, although I'd argue not in the way that a lot of people think it is. There are grievance mongers in Europe, and they are not entirely Islamist. There are grievance mongers who would like people to think that there's always a way out of this dispute. That, for instance, if Israel just gives up the Sheba farms or something, who to? Always you have to ask. But if it gave up the Sheba farms or the Golan Heights or the or Judea and Samaria, that this would bring about some kind of settlement. I don't think that's true at all. As I repeat, Islamist fundamentalism has its own very clear and differing schools of propulsion, and they would go on with or without us. As it is in Europe, we have and in Britain in particular. Britain has been a hub of Islamist activity for many years. It still strikes me that we don't feel the shame we ought to have done, and we ought to feel about what this country has done for some 15 years or so, by my accounting, in not pressing charges against the